Unfortunately, China seems to be also interested in the continuation of the war. For China, this war is a way to distract the US from the Pacific territory, from Taiwan, and from the other American allies close to China. And this is something also that divides the West, Europe, and the US, and it's something that distracts the Western countries from this larger conflict between a rising China and autocratic China on the one hand, and the democratic West on the other. So unfortunately, although there's a lot of talk from Beijing about peace, I think the opposite is actually true. The practical behavior of China shows that it is interested in a continuation of the war.
You know, at the same time, the media said that Putin lives in an illusion about the situation at the front. His generals tell him that Russia is advancing everywhere, but this is not true. How do you see Russia's current strategy?
I don't think Putin has that many choices. I think he is behaving the way he behaves because that is basically the only strategy left. As we discussed earlier, if there would be suddenly a ceasefire, that would be problematic for the regime, for the economy, for the society of Russia. But also the war is not going as well as portrayed by Russian propaganda. So there's little movement on the front line, in fact. But Russia is hoping, of course, that the Western alliance will break, that the financial support and the military support of the Western countries will go down, and that Ukraine will break somehow. And that is, so to say, his only chance in this situation. And so he is now, I would say, in a deadlock, and he's doing, basically, he's pursuing the only strategy that is currently for the preservation of his regime viable.
At the same time, we see the information in media. The Washington Post writes that the Russian economy may not survive in 2026 and could collapse. How do you think how this affects Russia's ability to continue the war?
I'm not an economist, so I wouldn't comment on this directly. But unfortunately, so far, the history of the full-scale invasion has shown that Russia can find ways around the sanctions, that it can run such a war economy. It's now certainly looking much worse than it looked in 2022-23, when actually the economy was rising because of the rising military demand. Now there's no growth anymore, but still perhaps the economy can somehow survive. China is supporting this. So unfortunately, we will have to proceed from the worst case scenario that the economy will somehow continue to function. And that's why more sanctions are needed, and also more military and financial support for Ukraine is needed.
This should be US sanctions or the European sanctions, I don't know, the 20th package of the European sanctions?
Well, in the best of cases, of course, both. And the sanctions had effect. We don't see it as much as we want to see it, but the war would have gone worse for Ukraine if there had not been these sanctions. And they have been a problem, and they are a problem for Russia, just not enough that this has a sufficient effect on the Russian economy, on the Russian state and the Russian military. But these sanctions do have effect, and then usually Russia finds ways to circumvent them. So both the US and the EU have to impose more sanctions, and also secondary sanctions, sanctions against the partners of Russia that enable Russia to circumvent the sanctions. So maybe that is now the main issue, that how far are the European countries and also Canada and the US, perhaps also Australia and Japan and so on, ready to also sanction not only Russian companies, but also non-Russian companies that help Russia to circumvent the sanctions.
And talking about the Trump's policy, I'd like to return to the Trump policy. How do you assess U.S. policy toward Russia, and what is, if we are talking about, in common, what is U.S. interests, or it's only the Trump private interests? How do you think?
Yeah, I think it's driven by Trump's private interests, both his interest, as we said already, in the Nobel Peace Prize, and perhaps also his business interests or the business interests of the people around him. And there are also, I guess, a lot of illusions about a new partnership with Russia and between Russia and the West, and or at least with the US. There's also the illusion that the US can break up the Russian-Chinese alliance somehow. That's called reverse Kissinger sometimes, something that Kissinger was in the 1970s able to do when there were Soviet-Chinese tensions. But there are no tensions now between Russia and China, so this idea of breaking this alliance is not viable. And in fact, the US is playing with fire here, because the US is now pressuring Ukraine to make concessions, and the US is even supporting to a certain degree Russia. But that, of course, breaks down the whole world order that we had the last 80 years, and breaks the logic of the non-proliferation regime for nuclear weapons. Because both Russia and the US and also China and North Korea are nuclear-armed states, whereas Ukraine is a non-nuclear weapon state. And this, of course, then creates a very dangerous precedent that it's good to have basically the message that so far Russia and also China and now the US as well are sending to the world. It's good to have nuclear weapons, and it's not good to not have nuclear weapons like Ukraine, and that can then make countries around the world rethink their national security strategies, and they may then start acquiring, if not nuclear weapons, then perhaps biological or chemical weapons, because they don't want to repeat the fate of Ukraine.
You know, some Republicans doesn't sure that Trump's current policy will help them to win the elections. How do you see? How do you think Trump's policy does it have future, and what is Trump's future in politics? Is impeachment is possible?
That is the impeachment issue is perhaps something about domestic affairs in the U.S. I haven't been, frankly, for several years to the U.S. I did live in earlier times in the U.S., but I don't feel competent anymore on commenting domestic affairs. But my hope is indeed that the preference of most ordinary Americans for U.S. support for Ukraine and for resistance against Russia will also then play a role in the midterm elections for the Congress, and also for the presidential elections, and that simply this policy that Trump is currently conducting vis-à-vis Ukraine and Russia will have lots of critics, and will then be a problem not only for Trump but also for the Republican Party, because it's undermining basically in a many decades old tradition of Republican foreign policy, of resisting countries like Russia and helping nations like Ukraine to liberate themselves, as once the Americans themselves liberated from British colonial rule.